my soul. And then comes the gospel. Today's reading is coming from Mark 7, and I believe it's 24 through 37. Jesus left that place and went to the vicinity of Tyre. He entered a house and did not want anyone to know it, yet he could not keep his presence secret. In fact, as soon as he heard about it, a woman whose little daughter was possessed by an impure spirit came and fell at his feet. The woman was Greek, born in Syria, Phoenicia. She begged Jesus to drive the demon out of her daughter. First, let the children eat all that they want, he told her. For this is not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs. Lord, she replied, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. Then he told her, for such a reply you may go. The demon has left your daughter. So she went home and found the child lying on the bed, and the demon was gone. Then they left the vicinity of Tyre and went through Sidon, down past the Sea of Galilee, and into the regions of the Decapolis. There, some people brought him a man who was deaf and could not talk. And they begged Jesus to place his hands on him. After he took him aside, away from the crowds, Jesus put his fingers into the man's ears. Then he spit and touched the man's tongue. He looked up at heaven, and with a deep sigh, he said to him, Ephphatha, which means be opened. At this, the man's ears were opened and his tongue was loosened, and he began to speak plainly. Jesus commanded them not to tell anybody, but the more he did so, the more they kept talking about it. The people were overwhelmed with amazement. He had done everything well, they said. He even makes the deaf hear and the mute speak. It's the word of God for the people of God.
Thank you.
It's a little fuller here than it was last week, but basically in last week's gospel verses in Mark, they were talking about clean and unclean food and what makes them clean. Jesus declared that food didn't make one unclean or spiritually defiled because it was an inner, what's inside the person that counted. Here in these two stories, Jesus declares that all persons are made in God's image. Whether a Gentile woman from Tyre or a man of unknown but definitely not Jewish race in the region of the Decapolis, also deeply into the Gentile territory. These stories show Jesus' repudiation of a tradition that grew into Judaism's belief that the true faith is only for those of the house of Israel. Still today, one of the most difficult challenges for most of us human beings lies in being able to see those outside our own camp, our community, our groups of familiar people as family. The irony, of course, reveals itself in that we are all in some way related. One of humankind's greatest myths is that we must be defined by our differences, despite knowing that any two human beings are genetically 99.9% identical. Not only are we interconnected as human beings, but with all creatures in nature and all living things that inhabit this earth. But let's be frank. At first hearing, this passage is a pretty difficult passage and even disturbing at times. So let's set the context straight a little bit. Jesus is again on the move, crossing yet more boundaries. He is journeying, in fact, far, far afield, both geographically and socially. And I'm sure the disciples were a little uncomfortable with that. But in Mark, they always make the disciples out as a little on the dull side, but at least they'll follow him wherever he goes. Tyre is a good deal further north than they've ever gone before, out on the edges of the Mediterranean Sea and well into Syrian territory. We don't know if he was scouting out new territory for missions or if he just wanted to escape and get a break from the crowds and controversies that were in Galilee and Judea. Yet whatever his motive was, he's not successful, as even in this remote locale, people had noticed him and have heard of him. Or like everywhere else he's gone, they come to him and indeed want something from him. And in this case, it's a woman of a Gentile woman, and Syrophoenician, which is in geography, if you do the Old Testament, that's Canaan territory, Canaanites. Very negative connotations. They did very pagan religions when they first came into the Promised Land. And so, being a woman and all these things, which is Mark's way of locating her about as far from Jesus socially as one can imagine. But this woman has heard about Jesus healing so many others. Why not her own daughter? Why not risking a woman going in front of a bunch of men, an out-of-towner, knowing full well what they thought of her, and their whole race for that matter? And then Jesus says the children have to be fed. It isn't right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs. Now, there's a couple of things. Dogs were pets even back then, but not in Israel. Because dogs were those flea-bitten, grungy little mutts that ran on the street. They would eat whatever was thrown to them. They would eat dead things that they would find on the street. And they wandered through the marketplace, and as you know, even the Pharisees had to wash up after they've been into the marketplace. So they were definitely considered unclean. So it was rare for the Jews to have a pet. That's why I like in the Chosen Matthew, who is an outcast Jew, had a pet dog, if you remember the Chosen series. But I'd love a reply. Even the puppies under the master's table eat of the children's crumbs. At first glance, it seems like Jesus is being harsh with this Greek woman when he says, let the children be fed first, for it is not right for the children's bread thrown to the dogs, right? But it's all in the words. Well, the word children refers to the Jews. And the word dog refers to the Gentiles. The Jews regarded Gentiles as unclean, like they did their dogs. And it was a very notorious term. And contempt. But interestingly, and you don't miss this now, Jesus does not actually use those words. That's why it's good to look through a couple translations. In the original Greek, and Mark was written in Greek, he does not use the generic word dog. Rather, he uses a diminutive word which describes how not the filthy dog of the street, but rather the little dog of the house, the family's beloved pet. And of course, we all know that the family pet gets a little more than just the crumbs. We don't have a pet. But our son and daughter-in-law have two little dogs. Mosby is my buddy, one old man to another. When we go over to their house for a big family gathering and a barbecue and all that stuff, that little dog is so excited because he knows he's going to get more than crumbs. Now they holler, don't get near the table and all this stuff, but Mosby can just come over and look at me and, you know, those little dog eyes, he says, Gramps, I can always trust on you to get a little something extra. No crumbs for me today. If there was ever anything different in Dickens' Great Expectations, Mosby could rewrite that one. So basically, Jesus replies, that's a good answer. Because, yes, the family pets do get more than just little bits. The family does eat first, and even after Mosby was usually pretty well behaved, but after we're breaking up, he starts looking for leftovers. And that's what she was expecting. And after that, Jesus tells her daughter is healed from a distance. Think about that. Great distance is not a problem for a great God. If you think back of some of the other miracles, especially when, as a good Jewish man, he wasn't supposed to go into their household, the Roman centurion come in there and asked him to heal either a daughter or a very close personal servant. And when he said it was, he said, "Do you want me to go?" He says, "No. You just tell me that," he said, "and I'll go." And Jesus was saying, that's great faith. And in Matthew's version of this same story, he says, "Your faith is great," which is something that he was hard-pressed to give to his own disciples after time. And now, without spending too much more time, the second half of this, the healing of the deaf and mute gentleman, they were further. I could see the disciples. Okay, we were here. We kind of put up with some of these locals, and Jesus healed a pagan woman, and no strings attached, mind you. And yet, Jesus said, okay, now we're going to go continue even deeper into this Gentile territory. And he finds this man. Now you can get caught up in the spit and the mud and different stories of fingers and ears, but that's not. There's one word I want you to remember. It's not necessarily a fatha. That's Aramaic. But it's be open. Be open. And after, those are the first words this man heard. Be open. He heard Jesus say, be open. Isn't that what we all need when we're in foreign situations or locations or uncomfortable positions? Be open. Be open to God's Spirit leading us to be a healing touch, a word of hope, a word of encouragement to someone else, someone that's not in our inner circle. What good is our faith if we only discuss it with other believers while we're at church and other family members, other unbelievers? It doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean anything as much. And knowing that the lectionary passes over, we'll be going to 8, but the last part of 7 and the beginning of 8, Jesus stays there in this non-Jewish territory. And he feeds a crowd. I think it's a second feeding. Everybody thinks the stories are different. It's a different story. Because this time, he's not feeding faithful folks inside of Galilee. These 4,000 people are in the area of the Decapolis. And he feeds them. Think about that. He fed the children of Israel first. But he knows his mission was all of God's children. And now he's feeding them. So we need to be open to seeing things a little differently. Be open to the mysteries. What might just look like breadcrumbs could actually be a sacramental moment. God's gifts of grace, mercy, and love are always best shared. And a lot of times they're unexpected. But that's the good news, and that's the gospel. Amen.